we've got a lot of cool panels coming up throughout the next few weeks. And we start off with this panel talking about Alaska Native tribal health organizations and kind of a little bit on tribal organizations in general as we cover them in Alaska, and differentiating the different kinds of information we can ask of them, what kind of reporting and public, if there's public filing required, and just getting us to a place where we can all better cover them in Alaska, because it's complicated and we want to get it right. And it's just really hard to wrap your head around, even as, a lifelong Alaskan and a longtime journalist here. I still don't understand all the ins and outs of everything. So I'm sure I'm not alone in that boat. So joining us today are Joaqlin Estus from Indian Country, reporter, long time, very familiar with her as a leader in reporting on Indian Country and Alaska Native issues, and Lloyd Miller, attorney, who works with Native tribal health organizations and others to kind of help explain some of that legal side of things. So I guess I'll give you both a chance to introduce yourselves and sort of talk about your particular areas of expertise, and then we'll hop into it. So I'm just going to go from left to right on my screen. Let's start with you, Joaqlin.
Well, hi, everybody. And I really miss our in-person Alaska Press Club conferences. They were always so much fun. So I'm with Indian Country today. I actually, I'm Tlingit, and Raven, and Frog, or Kacheti, and my family's from Wrangell. I started out as a historian, worked in coastal management. On a whim, I applied for an internship with Alaska Public Radio Network and worked at KTOO, Minnesota Public Radio, and KNBA. I worked at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium too, and now I'm with Indian Country today, and I'm glad to be here.
Thanks, Joaqlin. Lloyd, let's talk a little bit about your background.
Good morning. I'm Lloyd Miller. I've been a lawyer with the Sonosky Chambers law firm for over 40 years. I first came to Alaska. I'm an outsider. I came to Alaska in 1978. I worked for Judge Jim Fitzgerald, who's since passed on, but his legacy lives on in the courthouse, the federal courthouse in Anchorage, which is named after Judge Fitzgerald. I've been doing Indian law all of my career. It's why I went to law school. And my practice indeed focuses a lot on representing tribal health organizations and Indian tribes generally. At various times in my career, even the bulk of my practice has sometimes been for tribes outside Alaska. And this is because I work in a law firm that's based in Washington, D.C. So my initial practice was only for lower 48 tribes. After I left Alaska, I joined a law firm in Washington, D.C., really cut my teeth on Indian law in the lower 48, and returned to Alaska 5 years later, 1984. And then really delved deeply into Alaska Native legal issues, representation of healthcare organizations. I've had the good fortune to do a lot of litigation, Supreme Court litigation. It's been quite a ride. And some of you may know my wife better than you know me, which is perfect because she's much greater lawyer than I am. Her name is Heather Kendall Miller.
All right, thank you.
I can just dive in if you want, Rosie. I mean, Kortnie.
Yeah, that's great. That's I kind of like open forum, sort of talk about why these issues are important, why it's important for journalists to get them right. And I think it's also important to talk about sort of some of the ways we can get it wrong. And then again, we really want to get into, particularly probably with both of your expertise, both as a lawyer on the reporting side, or sorry, as a journalist on the reporting side and a lawyer on the legal side, sort of what, tribal health organizations and Native corporations sort of overall, they serve a lot of functions for many Alaskans that are sort of quasi-governmental, but they don't apply. They don't have the same public reporting, public disclosure kinds of laws and rules, but what's the best way for us to serve our readers, listeners, viewers when trying to get information about these giant organizations that have such an impact on things, particularly these days, well, all the time, but I think the rest of us who are not served by them are more aware of it now, the health organizations, when they're given, in this case, or, recently, the vaccination, tribal allocations, that kind of thing, that has such a huge impact on kind of all of us, as Alaska became the first state to broaden its vaccination requirements, largely in part because I think of the availability through the tribal health organizations. So yeah, Joaqlin, if you can
Sure.
start and
Yeah. So I'll start out by explaining, kind of giving a little bit of history about tribal health organizations, and then I'll pass on some tips that about how to cover them. So, and I'm going to start with a really big picture. I'm going to say the word genocide, and which is such a, it's so harsh. It's such a terrible thing, and it took me a long time actually to come around to understand that the United States did commit genocide against Native Americans. And in fact, what the United States did was practically a textbook example of genocide. And by that, I'm talking about the deliberate, systematic extermination of people and their culture. And the reason I say that is because the United States waged more than 1,500 attacks, raids, and wars against Native Americans, more than any other country against their indigenous peoples. So there were deadly epidemics, removal from land. It was US policy to take land and resources and to ban language, culture, and religion, and to remove kids. This was especially in the 20th century, remove kids from homes and put them in boarding schools. So some of this did touch on Alaska. Wrangell and Angoon were bombarded by the US military, and the boarding school era in Alaska didn't end until after 1972, when when there was a lawsuit, and as part of the settlement, the state agreed to build 120 schools in rural Alaska. So you had people who were self-sufficient and had lived on this land for millennia, suddenly, over a period of not very many years, couldn't own land, couldn't vote, couldn't attend territorial schools. You had people coming in from all over, citizens of other countries, and getting rich in the gold rushes. Alaska Natives couldn't file mining claims. They couldn't get financing to buy a boat. And probably most disturbing was that first the territory of Alaska and then the state of Alaska discriminated against Alaska Natives when it came to fishing and hunting. And there have been lawsuits about this. There's one from Yakutat about how the natives were only put in the dangerous areas to fish, and non-natives got to fish in calmer waters, for instance. Families were kicked off from the land where they'd had fish camps for generations. So in exchange, in response to all of that, the federal government, the United States, said it would provide health services. That initially was through the Department of War. Then it was through the Indian Health Service, which was severely underfunded, and it could not access other federal funds like Medicare, Medicaid, or private insurance. And then in the 1970s, there started to be laws, and the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1976 first said natives can take over and manage programs aimed at their own people from the federal government. Another law opened the door for the Indian Health Service to access Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance. And those revenues now make up about 60% of the funding that tribal health organizations have. So region by region, tribes in Alaska took over health services. In 1998, a consortium of tribes and tribal health organizations took over statewide services, and that includes water and sewer and health promotion, disease prevention, and specialty care at the Alaska Native Medical Center. South Central Foundation, a Native nonprofit, runs primary care at Alaska Native Medical Center. So, and then just for a quick overview of how this is all, how the system is set up, each region has its own tribal health organization with its own board of directors, its own administrative procedures, its own policies on how to handle the media. They cooperate in a statewide system with tiered care. So if you're in a village, you can get care from a community health aide. You might get referred to a sub-regional center where there are nurse practitioners and physician's assistants. You might go to a regional hub where they have doctors and hospitals, you know, Nome, Kotzebue, Dillingham, places like that. Or you might go to Alaska Native Medical Center where you can see an oncologist or a cardiologist. That's where the specialty care is. So, and you know, I have to say that the tribal health system, now that I'm working for a national organization and I'm in touch with tribes in the lower 48, I'll tell you, Alaska is doing a really good job. The tribal health system is really a gem, and it's unique. Nobody else has it. And people from other countries actually come here to find out, you know, to see how it's done, because, you know, countries that have the same problems with distance delivery of health services. So now, that's all very interesting and good, but there's the problem, the issue of how to cover them. And first of all, there is distrust from historical trauma. And then, I don't know if you guys know this, I'm increasingly aware of the, you know, the perception people have that the media is, you know, bad and that reporters are obnoxious. I mean, I was just watching a television program, an old film, and every time the media showed up, they were awful. So we have to overcome some of that. And, you know, but we have to do that with all kinds of organizations that are not friendly and open to the media. And so you would do that with tribal health organizations the same way you do it with other entities. And I would suggest that you build trust when before you get into a crisis or news event. Introduce yourself to the leaders, explain how you do your work, describe how credibility is essential to your, it's part of your professional code, so to speak. And then, and explain that if there's ever an inaccuracy, you want them to call you and you'll correct it. And that's reassuring to people because the one part of the fear is that they're going to say something wrong and they'll never live it down. So, and then you can talk about the reasons why it's important for them to talk and have an interview. And, you know, they can tell their side of the story. If there was an issue, they can explain how they're going to fix it. They can share cautionary tales. And I never play this card, but they are publicly funded. And they get a good share of their money from the federal government. Taxpayers have a right to know how that money's being spent. And so I've never actually said that to a source, but that's there if you need it. And then you should acknowledge confidentiality. Explain that you're not going to be seeking personal private information, medical histories, and you're not going to be using information like that unless a source steps forward and says, I want to share my story. So the other thing you can do is if you have a good source in a community, you're really good friends, or you've interviewed somebody at the school several times or something like that, and you feel comfortable doing it, you can ask them to vouch for you. You can ask them, could you just call this guy and put in a good word for me? And if the person's in good standing and does have that kind of relationship with you. And I'm going to end by saying that, sometimes people see Alaskan Natives as victims. And I want to emphasize that, we were thoroughly disenfranchised. And now we are citizens. Schools are desegregated. Regional corporations have a lot of clout. We have language preservation programs, scholarships. We had to fight for all of that. None of it was given to us. And there are a lot of heroes, and there are people who have dedicated their lives to civil rights and human rights, including Lloyd and his wife. And there are people who have fought hard, for these advances. The fight is not over, though. The Indian Child Welfare Act is under attack. Subsistence, the fight over subsistence just never ends. And there's still poverty and racism. There's violence against women, as we all know. And there's the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and all those issues remain to be resolved. So that's all I have for now.
All right, thank you, Joaqlin. Lloyd, if you want to give us a quick sort of rundown of, I guess, your experience. You've probably been through a lot of these big moments.
I'm happy to. Thank you. First, can you confirm that my voice is okay? You can hear me well?
Yep, I can hear you and I can see you again.
Okay. Thank you, Kortnie. Well, that was a splendid introduction, even if it's also quite a disturbing introduction from Joaqlin. Thank you very much for doing that. It is a history that is critically important. It informs everything I do every day. It should inform everything you do when you interact with tribal communities and their healthcare arms. It is something you cannot ever forget. I wanted to talk a little bit about the tribal institution in a deeper way, because I think it's very important to understand, without going too much into going law on you, if you like. It's really important to understand the legal background to what brings us to today's conversation. Alaska Natives and American Indians are comprised of tribes, tribal governments. Now, this isn't a radical thing. This is a well-accepted proposition. Indian tribes are named in the US Constitution. They predated the United States Constitution. They continue today. Every year, Congress adopts laws which speak of the tribes in the United States generally and tribes in Alaska in particular. The 1867 Treaty of Cession, which you all learn about in school, mentions the tribes of Alaska and how they are going to be addressed on an equal footing with the tribes in the lower 48. In the 1930s, the Interior Department had to look at the status of tribes everywhere in the United States. There were numerous opinions written in the early 30s by the Interior Department. And again, the government talked about how Alaska tribes are on an equal footing with tribes everywhere else, self-governing, sovereign entities. And of course, fast forward into the 1990s, and Congress actually adopts legislation which says this. This is important for a couple of reasons. Because of the governmental nature of the Indian tribes, certain federal responsibilities arose early in the nation's history. And if you're even a casual student of federal Indian law, you usually learn about some legal opinions written by Chief Justice John Marshall in the 1830s. And you hear about that in almost mythical terms because those cases launched the foundation of federal Indian law. And and I could go off on this, they are terribly colonialist creations of Indian law in a framework that places Indians entirely in a subservient position to the United States government. That important topic aside, which I hesitate to do, we could talk about it in the question and answer. Those opinions also recognize that tribes are pre-existing governments and that as governments, they survive the establishment of the United States. This is in the 1830s, right? So it's very recent after the establishment of the United States. It's only been 60 years since the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution was written in 1787. So this is very early on in the nation's history, and there's a recognition that tribal governments are pre-existing governments that continue to remain as governmental institutions. But because the tribal governments have been, by then, effectively dominated by the United States government, they have become, in terms of a power structure, and this is indisputably true for large portions of the country at that time, although not areas in the West and not in Alaska, they become subservient to the United States government. And the government has taken on a duty to care for the tribal communities. And it said, as a guardian would its wards. As I said, it's pretty insulting language. But also embedded in that concept is a duty of care and protection by the federal government. And this particular duty later comes to be called the trust responsibility. And it imbues everything that the federal government does with respect to Indian tribes. Even fast forward today, OMB is having a tribal consultation session with Indian tribes across the United States. You may have seen some publicity about this. The duty of tribal consultation springs from the trust responsibility between the United States government and the tribal governments. I mention this trust responsibility because it is critical to understanding why there is a healthcare system in the first place. It arises out of that basic trust responsibility. And when the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was being negotiated, the question was raised, well, if Congress is going to create this whole corporate system, which I won't go into very much today, but unless you have questions and answers about it, it sounds like Congress is moving in a different direction, and maybe Congress is contemplating doing away with this trust responsibility and is creating a new regime where formerly tribal communities will now become corporate communities, taking care of their own affairs through a corporate structure. Actually, that question was raised and it was answered, no, we're not going that far. In fact, Congress had in the preceding couple of decades adopted legislation that did terminate the trust responsibility for many tribes down south, especially in Oregon and Washington, California, and some other areas in the Midwest. But Congress actually very consciously decided, no, good question, we're not doing that. The Alaska Native community pointed out that the value of those trust services would dwarf the value of the $900 million settlement being done in 1971. So it's important to understand the source of these services. So often your readership and your listeners believe that healthcare for Alaska Native people, they're getting a free ride, free services. What are you complaining about? It's actually an obligation that the United States have, a legally binding obligation ever since the amendment of the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act, an enforceable obligation, a judicially enforceable obligation. So that's thing one. Thing two springs from thing one, not the trust responsibility part, but the tribal sovereignty part. Tribes are their own governments. And when you're thinking of yourselves, of course you think of yourselves as reporters, but when you put on your reporter hats and you think about your approach to a tribal government, in some ways you might think of yourself as, how would I approach Canada? I'm going to call an official with the Canadian government. And not just in terms of the respect due and so forth, but what laws apply. Now, the Freedom of Information Act doesn't apply to Canada, right? It applies to the federal government. It doesn't apply to the state of Alaska. The state of Alaska has its own public meetings laws and related disclosure laws. Those laws don't apply to tribal governments or Canada, right? So what laws apply to Canada? Canada's own laws. So if you were interviewing officials with the government of Canada or British Columbia, you would want to learn, okay, what do they need to tell me? What laws have they adopted? Doesn't matter if they're engaged in foreign relations with the United States. The United States provides $1 billion for jets. It's irrelevant. What's important is knowing the laws of that government. Well, now you come to Alaska tribal governments. It's important to know what the laws are of the tribal governments, because the Federal Freedom of Information Act, the state public open meetings laws, none of that applies to tribal governments. And as we've learned in recent litigation, none of that applies to the arms of the tribal governments, which are these regional nonprofits and the statewide Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. It wasn't covered much in the press. And I say that, I didn't mean that as a criticism, it's just meaning that you may not know this, but there have been several court decisions over the last 5 or 8 years that have ruled that the health organizations are arms of the tribal governments, and they are themselves governmental entities, but tribal governmental entities, because they are controlled by the tribal governments that created them and that appoint their boards of directors and control their activities. And this has been so decisions, if I'm not misspeaking, I think the Southeast Alaska Regional Health Consortium, Canada Chiefs Conference, the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, maybe YKHC. So this has become pretty established law, and it's been decisions from federal judges mostly that have made these rulings. So when you talk to these organizations, you are talking to independent governments. And so I would, probably the one small point I would differ a little bit is they may be recipients of public funds, but it doesn't make them anything other than tribal governments. Like I said, just like the government of Canada may be a recipient of federal money. So otherwise, I think that Joaqlin's cautions are really very, very, very good. I have the same cautions. I approach the press. Many of you have interviewed me. I wouldn't say I am suspicious, because I very much enjoy talking with any of you who I've met. I mean, really to a person. The reporter community is great, but I am wary. I'm always wary. And you may be surprised, or maybe you expect it, and maybe it puts a chip on your shoulder. I don't know. People think that the reporter's job is to, get a gotcha moment, like our former governor once said. It's all about investigative journalism to find something wrong. And if a reporter's calling you, it's like the police calling you. Something is wrong, or something is perceived to be wrong. So I think anything you can do along the lines that Joaqlin suggested to put people at ease, if you can. If that's not what you're up to, I wouldn't be dishonest if it is what you're up to. If you're dishonest, you'll be detected. And I noticed you are not dishonest people. Credibility is everything. I would also talk with people about the ability to talk on background, because sometimes you really want to understand what's going on, and someone is not going to tell you unless you give them a complete reassurance of confidentiality. And if you can do that, and tell them about speaking on background, tell them about speaking off the record. Because I frequently have found a situation where a reporter, maybe new to the field or new just to the topic, is really going off in the wrong direction, but I'm hesitant to say anything. Maybe my client has told me not to talk with the press on an issue, and yet I really want to set you straight. And you all have been very good about that when you're professionals, and whether it's your community here or the New York Times or the Post, people have been really very good about honoring that code. And that can be another way of talking to tribal governments. So keep that in mind as well. Those were some of the introductory remarks. Kortnie, I don't want to dominate too much. I probably already took too much time. Thank you.
Oh, no, that's great. Thank you. Just a moment. So one of the questions that came in our Q&A, I think it was posed sort of before you outlined that, the laws of a tribal organization are, that of their own sovereign entity. But I think it's something that, as we report to serve our communities and people contact us with concerns about, improper use of XYZ funding or, improper, management of these organizations. And we, just like we would at the city council level, we want to try to get to the bottom of it. So this question is, how can journalists get access to economic spending or funding documents for tribal health corporations? How can journalists access information to sort of follow the money? And as you said, they're just, with public funds, are there other ways to sort of find that out, like reporting to the, like Indian Health Service? Is there any place like that that could give a bigger picture of how things are going to, sort of sort these things out? Because I know a lot of times people will call us and we say, what you're describing sounds like something we should look into, but we just don't know how, like whether it's something going wrong or not. But I think that's a big struggle, is just figuring out how to look at it and see if there even is a problem as it's portrayed.
Right. Well, I'm glad for the question. The Indian Health Service does have a lot of information about the tribal healthcare system, as well as what we call the direct healthcare system. So the piece of the healthcare system that continues to be run by the Indian Health Service. So in theory, they are a great public agency. Doing FOIA requests, if you have the time, if you're doing a deeper dive on a topic, can be pretty effective. Sadly, in the Trump years, FOIAs went in the black hole. I just got a request from the FOIA office at the Indian Health Service asking me if I still wanted a response to a request that's 3 years old. Yeah, now maybe they handle reporter requests differently. I don't know, probably. I'd like to think so, but yeah, you can make a Freedom of Information Act request or try to interview somebody at the Indian Health Service, and tribes may, or tribal health organizations may also. The larger ones, obviously the very largest one in the state, the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, and I think also South Central Foundation, which does all the primary care work out there on the campus. I think they each have media offices, so they're pretty astute in this area because they get so many inquiries. You may not see a media person officially at the Bristol Bay Health Corporation or Norton Sound Health because they don't get that many inquiries. I don't know. I could be wrong about that. But yes, those agencies, as well as HHS. Remember, HHS may provide grants. So HSS, the state Health and Social Services Department, unless the governor's busted it up recently, can be another place.
Thank you. Joaqlin, if you have, routes that you found to kind of seek out that information.
Well, first, thanks so much, Lloyd, for making that point about federal funding and access, transparency. I didn't know that myself, and so obviously, and so I appreciate you making that clear. So as far as getting information, I mean, it's hard, and I would say the Indian Health Service, it's almost a lost cause. I mean, if a reporter calls, they're going to refer you to Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. will take 2-3 days to reply. And half the time they say, unless it's in their interests, then they, might call you back that day. But otherwise, it'll take them a couple of days. And, they just don't respond very well to requests for information. Sometimes, but they are a federal agency. And so a lot of what they do, so like the distribution plan for the vaccine that they came up with, how they were going to distribute that all across the country to all the tribal health organizations, that was published online. And so if you scout around on their website, you can find good, useful information. Then as far as getting information about, this is beyond I'm not an investigative reporter. And so I have never filed a Freedom of Information Act request. And I pretty much just live with the fact that the regional corporations and tribal health organizations pretty much are a closed door. And so if somebody else has some tips, I'd be happy to hear those.
I do think there's a lot of information that the health organizations put out themselves. If you're like me, I'm inherently lazy, right? So I want to pick up the phone, or I want to send an email to somebody and just get an answer. But it's amazing what you can find on the internet with the kind of diligence Joaqlin is talking about, either what the Indian Health Service is up to when you didn't think it was there, or even what the healthcare organizations are doing. You mentioned, by the way, ANCs, regional corporations, and I think Joaqlin meant the regional for-profit corporations. We can talk about them later, but they're a different category altogether. They're for-profit private companies under the law, like, Microsoft, whatever. They're private companies. So that's a different thing. They're not arms of tribal governments. They're not tribal governments. They don't have sovereignty, but there are different impediments to your getting information, just like there are different impediments to getting information from Microsoft or Facebook or any other company.
Yeah, thank you for all that insight. That is all great. I guess that was one Q&A. Let me check the chat. If anybody has questions, oh, here we go. We've got a few over here in the chat. Nat Hers asked, do you guys think there are more stories or examinations that reporters should be doing about tribal health organizations? Should they be doing less and allowing Alaska Native people to hold these institutions accountable in different ways, or should they be approaching stories differently?
I would say, I think the coverage in Alaska is really good, and the more coverage, the better. So,
yeah, I would go to the old adage, ignorance breeds contempt. And when the readership and the listening audience doesn't know what's happening on the big campus, doesn't know what the health organizations are doing, and just every once in a while here's some number, someone got $1 million or 10 million or 100 million or $1 billion came into Alaska. Ignorance breeds contempt. And as we saw the reaction to the article, the coverage, the story, the public radio story about SCF, that's dangerous. That is not healthy at all. So I think to the extent you can get out into the community information about initiatives and exciting things that are going on, because there really are incredible things going on across the bush. What's going on with telemedicine in Alaska? People talk about it in the broad national way and how COVID has opened the door. It's been something that the native healthcare system has been doing a long time, and it's just limited by broadband capacity. But there's been dedicated bandwidth to the telemedicine system. I just thought of that as one. There are so many success stories. And I think obviously the COVID success story got covered because COVID has been so much in the news. Otherwise, it would have gone unnoticed. So maybe it's not a favorite story. I don't know. I don't know your trade, your business. I think of people, everybody is an investigative journalist, but I guess it's not true. Maybe people don't want to do good stories, I don't know. Rather find out some terrible fraud happening someplace and bring the light of day on that terrible fraud, which is critically important. I'm glad you all do that. But I can't believe I'm saying this. There are good news stories out there too. These are very economically powerful organizations that employ thousands and thousands of people across the state, and Native people in healthcare professions. I mean, they're just doing God's work, as people would say, as Chief Compcop would tell me in Tatitlik every day. But the story doesn't get out of what they're doing and what they're up against when they do it. In COVID, it has. And I think there have been terrific stories about how the health organizations have risen to the moment in the COVID era and struggled to deal with it, especially those early weeks and months.
It looks like, thank you, Lloyd. It looks like Anna Rose with KYUK in Bethel has a question, and she's unmuted so she can ask her question.
Hi, thanks for doing this. My question is, if tribal health corporations are sovereign entities, then who is creating those laws for the sovereign entities? So is that from the tribes who are in compact with that corporation, or is it the corporation board who creates bylaws? If we need to understand the laws for the sovereign entity, how do we understand who's creating them?
Thank you. That's a great question. And it's a natural question from what I was saying. Well, it's really both. The tribes, you said you're from Bethel? Anna, I think
Yes.
Anna said she's from Bethel. So YKHC has a governance structure. I know something about them. There are 3 or maybe 4 seats that are appointed by the Bethel tribe, ONC, I say, because I can't pronounce the O well enough to not embarrass myself. And then there are so many tribes that instead of having a 56-member board, tribes are gathered in units. So a unit of 3 or 4 or 5 tribes appoint a board member. And that's usually a council member or tribal chairperson from one of those 4, 3, 5 villages in that unit. So then you have this elected tribal leader who's now serving on the YKHC board, along with the representatives from the Bethel tribe. And then that board, yes, sets the policy through the adoption of personnel procedures and procurement procedures and bylaws and articles. And I mean, then you move into the language. The language is corporate lingo because YKHC was organized as a not-for-profit under state law. And of course, they do all the disclosures they are required to do as a not-for-profit under federal law as well. But the legal regime is controlled by the board. They have the ultimate authority there, and of course by the tribes if they decide to remove the board or change the board from election to election.
Hey, Lloyd, just following up on that question. Hopefully my microphone is on.
Yep, you're good, Jacob.
Okay. Those meetings that these regional tribal health organizations like Search or the Yukon Health in Bethel, what are the minimum reporting requirements? I mean, can reporters request the minutes of these proceedings or any of the packets, the briefing packets to board members, like the manager's reports and things like that? Or is it totally up to the individual bylaws of these individual organizations?
Generally, those things are not publicized. That's up to the. I mean, you can ask for anything, but it's up to the organization to decide if it wants to disclose any of the things you just mentioned: meeting minutes, executive director reports. Now, executive director reports, by the way, are often actually published in the periodic reports that these organizations issue. Sometimes they are. And I would think that a health organization would, if there was a report of that kind provided to another agency, they will not feel that there's as much of a concern versus something that's been only shared with the board of directors or only with the tribal councils. So I find that each organization is different. There's no set of rules that applies to all of them because they're all different tribal governments, intertribal organizations. You just have to see. And to be sure, there are some organizations that are much less forthcoming. I would say none that have been mentioned so far than others. I think the ones that you've mentioned are generally pretty forthcoming. I see Dan Winkleman quoted in the press quite a bit. You must have a good relationship out there in Bethel. And he knows that it's important to work with the public. And when he's talking to the Bethel press, he's talking to his own tribal councils and their tribal members. So I think that organization is, as long as we're mentioning them, one of the ones that will be quite accessible. And that whole Tuluksak event where there was a fire, destroyed the water treatment facility. I thought there was a tremendous amount of transparency in that story. You didn't get an organization stonewalling the reporters, and it was good. And because I think the public, in reading those articles, which is how I got my news, understood just how hard it is to fix it. It couldn't be fixed right overnight. It was actually an ice road that had to be thick enough to haul this piece of equipment that's terribly heavy, and the logistical problems in making all of that happen. So anyway, I thought you did a great job on that story. Many of you were involved in that press, and it was one that could have spun out of control. And look, there's no water coming to this community and nobody cares. Well, that wasn't what the story ended up being, because a lot of people actually did care and were working really hard to solve the problem. Looks like John McKay, I got a chat note from him. He's trying to ask a question.
I was also just going to interject. This is Nat, that at least all of the regional health organizations are like federally chartered nonprofit organizations with requirements to file tax returns to the federal government, which is the source of a fair amount of information that I think goes into stories. So that is like an obvious resource you can turn to. And I think there are other, sources of information about their bylaws and things like that are accessible under just garden variety nonprofit procedures and laws.
That's right.
Yeah,
So
thanks, Nat.
John had a couple of good questions. One, let's see, are most of the tribal health organizations organized as corporations under federal and state law? If so, what laws are there that apply to these organizations that may afford access to documents and information that help understand their workings? To the extent they're corporations, are they subject to the same rules governing other corporations with respect to access to records as corporations not controlled by or affiliated with sovereign tribes? I mean,
It's a great
Lloyd,
question.
Yeah.
They really have two hats. I mean, there are two characters to them. They are intertribal organizations. John is absolutely right. I mean, he's onto this. They are also corporations organized under state law and qualified as usually, actually, I think exclusively as 501c3s under federal law. And as Nat pointed out, that there are therefore tax filing requirements. There are some state filing requirements, that are fairly minimal for nonprofit corporations under Alaska state law. The biannual report that has to be done, unless that's changed, that's just every 2 years. Articles have to be on file, but not bylaws. I think many of you may be familiar with what's required under state laws. It's not that much, but what there is there. And yes, those the form that Nat mentioned, which also talks about compensation of the highest individuals in the organization. People seem to often be interested in compensation levels. That's all there as well. There's no, to John's question, there is no exemption from those reporting requirements as a result of their character as intergovernmental tribal organizations.
so my experience in looking up stuff like that is that it's very broad. They don't get into very much, if any, detail at all. I'm actually curious to hear from reporters who, and I mean, what's hard is getting information to document malfeasance. And if any of you have been able to uncover that information, I think all of us would be interested to hear how you did that. And then I don't know if everybody can see the second question John wrote. He said, can you talk a little about the Indian Civil Rights Act and its protections for free press, free speech? Explain who it protects and who it doesn't, not non-natives.
Right. I don't let me forget Indian Civil Rights Act. I will. Well, maybe I'll go to that now. I was going to comment on something else. Yeah. So the Indian Civil Rights Act was enacted because of something I said early on in my opening remarks, which is that tribes predated the United States. That had sovereign governments. They were addressed in the Articles of Confederation and then in the U.S. Constitution, but they predate both documents. They did not consent to the Constitution. I mention this because this whole idea of state consent to the Constitution and the plan of the convention, those concepts of states ceding sovereignty to the federal government, that's a whole discussion that doesn't apply to tribal governments. And since tribal governments were not part of the Constitution and not parties to the Constitution, nothing in the Constitution applies to the tribal governments, including the amendments to the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So because of that, tribal governments regulate their own affairs vis-a-vis individual rights when we're talking about the Bill of Rights issues. Congress was moved in the 60s to change that because Congress was granted in the Constitution, granted itself, complete plenary authority over the affairs of tribes. That's in the Indian Commerce Clause. So exercising that power, Congress adopted the Indian Civil Rights Act, and it lays out the rights which tribal governments must accord tribal members in their day-to-day operations. So there, yes, free speech and due process, anti-discrimination provisions. Interestingly, one thing is establishment of religion is not included. The prohibition on establishment of religion is not included in the Indian Civil Rights Act, even though it's in the Bill of Rights. And in fact, many tribal governments are deeply religious institutions. And I think immediately the Pueblos, where maybe many of you also have seen this quite actively displayed every day. So those provisions apply. They apply a little differently in the case of non-native offenders who commit any of the offenses discussed in the Violence Against Women Act. VAWA accorded authority to tribal governments to prosecute non-natives who commit violence against Indian women. It also requires that the Indian Civil Rights Act apply if a tribe is going to do that. And there are some other protections, including about tribal attorney to defend from the charge. That's about it. This is, I would say, a developing area. The extent to which tribes' authority over non-members will continue to be expanded by Congress. There's a proposal in the House-passed Violence Against Women Act to do so. It's really critically important that Congress do so. The courts won't, Congress can, and violence against women, Native American women in Alaska Native villages and elsewhere is epic. Proportions are just stunningly high. Something I hope you all continue to cover because it is such a terrible issue, and the Daily News has been doing a great series that touches on these issues. Enough said. But thanks for the question, John.
So John also
Thank you.
asked if Native journalists can use information they get because of their status as a member of a tribe or a shareholder in a native corporation. And Lloyd, maybe you have comments on this, but I would say yes. And, you know, if somebody comes to the journalist and says that was information for shareholders only, you can protect your source, which would be yourself, and just not have any comment or response. Does that sound right, Lloyd?
I'm trying to find the question.
Okay, so if
Oh,
you're
I
a
see it. I
shareholder-
see it in the box. I see it.
if you're a shareholder or a tribal member and you go to meetings and you get handouts or people talk about stuff, and you're a native journalist, can you use that information?
Well, I mean, I don't think a reporter is violating a statute. If I can reframe the question, if it publishes information that a shareholder gave the reporter, I mean, if that's the question, of course, the limitations on publication of information on reporters are few and far between.